July 4, 1942. The Arctic Ocean, north of Norway. The sky never really gets dark here, only fades into a flat grey twilight that presses down on steel decks and tired faces. On the bridge of a Liberty ship in Convoy PQ 17, an American merchant captain glances at his watch, then at the stars and stripes folded on the chart table. It's Independence Day, but there is no celebration planned, only more cold, more mist, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond that curtain of low cloud, German eyes are watching. Hundreds of miles away in London, in a room lined with oak and dominated by a single broad desk, the First Sea Lord is staring at a different kind of grey. The blurred shapes of enemy symbols, pins, and lines on an operations map. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound rests his hand on a pencil, tapping it once, twice, then stops. The war in the Arctic has come down to this room, this table, and the men waiting around it. The message summaries in front of him tell a confusing story. German heavy units have left their berths, or perhaps they haven't. A U-boat report claims to have seen a British battleship escorting the convoy, or perhaps it misidentified a cruiser. Luftwaffe reconnaissance may have sighted the convoy, or perhaps the weather turned them back. None of it is certain. What is certain is that 34 merchant ships are ploughing through ice and fog toward Soviet ports, and that somewhere in northern Norway sits the battleship Tirpitz, the ship that haunts every Admiralty meeting about the Arctic. Around the First Sea Lord, junior staff officers exchange nervous glances. They have just given their opinions. Most said the same thing. Keep the convoy together, keep the close escort in place, let the cruisers hover nearby, and wait for clearer information. Only one man in the room argued for a drastic measure. Pound leans back in his chair and closes his eyes. For half a minute, the only sound is the ticking of the brass-bound clock behind him. One of the younger officers, unable to help himself, murmurs to a colleague, "His lordship's dropped off." Perhaps Pound hears it. Perhaps he doesn't. Either way, his eyes open again, and his decision is made. He reaches for a message pad and begins to write. The convoy is to be dispersed. He says aloud. The words fall into the silence like a depth charge. A half-dozen jaws slacken around the table. Dispersed now? In the very killing ground the Germans have prepared. No one speaks, but several pairs of eyes say the same thing. This is madness. Pound raises both hands from the wrist. A gesture that says, enough. The decision is his. The responsibility will be his as well. In that moment, in a city far from the ice and spray of the Barents Sea, the fate of PQ-17 is sealed. To understand how it came to this, how a senior admiral could decide to send a convoy into the teeth of U-boats and bombers without the shelter of formation and escort, you have to go back to the coded name itself, and to a chain of earlier successes that lulled men into believing the Arctic could be tamed. The designation, PQ, began as a small administrative convenience. A Royal Navy officer, Commander P.Q. Richards, had been tasked with drafting the assembly and operations orders for the new convoys that would run from Iceland to the ice-clogged ports of northern Russia. The operations staff began referring to them simply as the PQ convoys, and the name stuck. PQ eastbound to Russia, QP westbound back to Britain. In the last 6 months of 1941, the Arctic seemed almost kind. 12 convoys made the run with the loss of only one merchant ship out of 103 dispatched. One ship. In that first winter, the enemy seemed far away and clumsy. The sea itself, the real threat, ice, storms, bitter cold. It felt too many, too good to be true. It was. With the spring of 1942 came the thaw. And with the thaw came the Germans. they had reasons of their own to turn Norway into a fortress. Hitler feared an Allied invasion of Norway that could outflank Germany's northern flank and threaten iron ore shipments from Sweden. At the same time, he saw a chance to choke the flow of tanks, trucks, food, and ammunition that Britain and America were sending to Stalin's embattled Red Army. The Allies had reasons just as pressing for keeping that flow open. Each rifle and artillery piece delivered to the Soviet Union was a weapon that would be used against German divisions, tying down hundreds of thousands of men that might otherwise appear in France, in North Africa, even in the Atlantic itself. And behind every crate shipped east was a political calculation. Stalin had already made one deal with Hitler before the war. If he felt that Britain and the United States could not or would not sustain him, might he make another? In the spring of 1942, the Wehrmacht's summer offensive in Russia was gathering force again. In North Africa, Rommel had stormed Tobruk and was driving deep into Egypt. British commanders in Cairo were studying contingency plans for falling back toward the Nile Delta. The possibility that the Afrika Korps might reach the Middle East and link up with German forces driving through the Caucasus was not fantasy. It was a nightmare scenario that planners had to take seriously. If that happened, the Soviet Union could be strangled from the south. Stalin knew it, Churchill knew it, Roosevelt knew it, and Stalin, who trusted no one, pressed harder than ever for convoys. More convoys, faster convoys, he pressed, and he did not give. When British officers asked for Soviet destroyers to help escort convoys through the most dangerous stretch, from the North Cape to the Kola Inlet, Stalin said no. When they asked permission to set up a British command post north of Murmansk to coordinate defense, he refused. Requests for Soviet air cover over the Barents Sea met the same answer. Yet the demands for tonnage, armor, and explosives never reduced by a gram. Even so, the Allies had no choice. Breaking with Stalin now would risk exactly what they feared most, a separate peace between Berlin and Moscow. So they swallowed their frustration and continued to send the convoys, lining ships up in Iceland and hoping that their escorts and their luck would hold for Hitler. The problem looked simpler on paper. Britain was an island. The United States was 3,000 miles away. Without ships, their industry was useless. If he could destroy Allied merchant fleets faster than they could be rebuilt, he could starve Britain into submission and keep American production from reaching any front. For that, he needed wolves in the Atlantic and hammers in the north. So, early in 1942, the German naval staff began shifting weight to Norway. The new battleship Tirpitz, sister to the lost Bismarck, slid from the Baltic to She was massive, heavily armored, and, in British eyes, terrifying. Intelligence reports suggested that Bismarck had not been sunk by British shells in her final battle, but scuttled by her own crew when she could no longer steer. If those reports were true, then no British gun had ever truly tested the full strength of a battleship of that class. Soon, Tirpitz was meant to be joined by more heavy metal. In February, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, veterans of the North Atlantic, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugene, were ordered to break out from Brest and join her. In one audacious move, they dashed up the English Channel, under the noses of the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. It was a slap in the face to British pride, but it came at a cost. Both battleships struck mines and limped into Kiel for repairs. Prinz Eugene, at sea later with Admiral Scheer, took a torpedo from a British submarine that shredded her steering gear. She, too, went back to the Baltic. By the time spring bled into early summer, the German heavy group in Norway was smaller than planned, but still deadly. The pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, a growing pack of and an increasing number of Luftwaffe squadrons redeployed north as the Arctic weather improved. It was enough to make the Admiralty lose sleep. Convoy PQ-17 was going to sail straight into that storm, and no one on its bridges knew just how much depended on the choices being made in London and Kiel. The trouble had not begun with PQ-17, it had been building. Raid by raid, convoy by convoy. On March 1, 1942, Convoy PQ-12 left Iceland with 16 ships bound for Murmansk. 5 days later, German spotters sighted them near Jan Mayen Island. Tirpitz slipped moorings at Trondheim and slid into the grey Atlantic, accompanied by 3 destroyers. It was the moment the Admiralty had dreaded. The northern giant was on the move, toward a convoy of mostly unarmed merchantmen. But Allied submarines were watching. One boat, patrolling off Norway, glimpsed the distant profile and sent a contact report. Tirpitz at sea. Course northeast. That signal went south to Whitehall, across to the Home Fleet flagship, and into the hands of Admiral John Tovey, whose task was to cover the convoys and hunt any German heavy ships that might try. For the Atlantic, Tovey turned east with his battleship King George V and the carrier Victorious. Feeling his way through Arctic fog, for 3 days both sides searched, blinded by snow squalls and blown off course by gale force winds. When the weather briefly cleared, aircraft from Victorious finally sighted Tirpitz, a dark wedge on the grey water, and radioed back positions for a strike. But Tirpitz, too, had been warned. German radio intelligence had cracked British ciphers back in 1940. And they now listened as nervously as the British did, when decoded traffic suggested a major British force at sea. Captain Carl, top of Tirpitz, decided he would not risk his ship for a handful of freighters. He turned for home. The British did not know that. All they knew was that somewhere ahead there was a battleship, and that the window to hit her was closing. 25 biplane Albacore torpedo bombers droned off Victorious's deck, engines struggling in the cold air. They found Tirpitz near the Lofoten Islands and attacked in waves, threading themselves through hurricane bursts of flak from her 4-inch, 40mm, and 20mm guns. For a few long minutes the Arctic sky was full of black puffs and the white wakes of torpedoes, all converging on one point. When it was over, the torpedoes had missed. Not one had found Tirpitz's hull. She had sailed through a literal ring of steel and ice without a scratch. The Dutch bombers, late to the scene and alone, lost her in fog. It was a lesson the Germans took to heart. Afterward, Hitler personally ordered that no heavy ships were to risk a sortie unless he knew exactly where the British carriers and battleships were, and unless sufficient air cover could be provided from land. The only German carrier, Graf Zeppelin, lay unfinished. That meant relying on the Luftwaffe's fields in northern Norway. More squadrons were sent north. At sea, a special U-boat formation, the Eis-Teufel, the Ice Devils, was formed to operate exclusively in the Barents Sea, lying in wait for the convoys that hugged the pack. Ice to keep out of range of bombers. The convoys still went. PQ-13 sailed in late March and paid the price. German destroyers attacked while U-boats and bombers closed in. About a quarter of the merchantmen were sunk. A British cruiser, Trinidad, took a torpedo, one of her own, as it turned out, bent back in a grotesque arc by the ice-cold water, and limped, wounded, through the floes. Another destroyer, Eclipse, was badly damaged. The Germans lost nothing. PQ-14 ran into pack ice, trying to skirt Luftwaffe range. 14 of its 23 ships suffered ice damage and had to turn back. PQ-15 lost 5 of 20 ships, and the cruiser Edinburgh, patrolling ahead of the convoy, took a U-boat's torpedo. While she lay helpless, 3 German destroyers appeared to finish her. They did not. Edinburgh's guns, thought to be dead, swung round and opened fire. The lead German destroyer, Hans Lodi's sister ship, Hans Schoeman, was hit in the first salvo and began to sink. Another destroyer was mauled and had to be towed away. Edinburgh had to be scuttled in the end, but not before she reminded the Kriegsmarine that wounded British cruisers could still bite. By early May, the Admiralty had had enough. They had lost 2 major cruisers in barely a month. Voices at Whitehall began to call the Arctic route a millstone round our necks. Some senior officers urged a halt to the PQ runs until better weather, better escorts, or both, could be assembled. Winston Churchill listened. He understood the naval arguments, and he also understood the politics. Roosevelt wanted convoys. Stalin demanded them. Stalin grudgingly agreed to things he had refused before. Soviet air raids on Luftwaffe fields in northern Norway. Destroyers to help with escort duties, permission for a British command post north of Murmansk. But the price was clear. The convoys must sail. Churchill, ever the gambler, made his calculation. The operation is justified if half get through, he said. It was not a sentiment the Admiralty shared, but an order is an order. So PQ-16 sailed on May 20th, with 35 merchant ships and the heaviest escort yet sent north. 5 destroyers, 4 trawlers, 4 corvettes, a mines, and a cam ship with a Sea Hurricane fighter perched on a launching catapult, ready to fling itself into the air once and sacrifice itself in exchange for the chance to break up a bomber attack. They would need it. 5 days out from Iceland, just past Bear Island, the Luftwaffe came in. 30 torpedo bombers and 5 dive bombers attacked, and others followed, in more than 200 sorties over 2 days. The sky above PQ-16 looked at times like a continuous raid, but the escorts and the cam ship fought like demons. At the end of it, 6 merchant ships had been sunk, too many, but 29 were still heading east. U-boats, including some from the new Ice Devil group, took 3 more. PQ-16 showed that convoys could survive even heavy air and submarine attack if they stayed together. If escorts were aggressive, and if any fighters could be put up, but it also convinced the German naval staff that planes and submarines alone would never guarantee the total destruction they wanted. If they were to wipe out an entire convoy to the very last ship, including the escort vessels, as one directive put it, they would need the big guns. So, in June, they drew up a plan. Extra fuel was allotted for Tirpitz, for Admiral Scheer, for the new heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and for the pocket battleship Lut. The operation was given a name with a touch of chessboard. Arrogance, Rosselsprung Knight's move. The intention was brutal and simple. When the next PQ convoy crossed the Barents Sea, it would be shadowed by U-boats and bombers. Those U-boats and aircraft would report its position constantly, wear it down, split its escort. Then, when the time was right, the heavy surface force would slip around the top of Norway and fall upon it in one overwhelming blow. When Grand Admiral Erich Raeder took Rosselsprung to Hitler at the Borough, the Führer was skeptical. He remembered all too well the close call with Tirpitz in March. He reminded Raeder of his orders: no sorties without reliable information on British carrier and battleship locations, and no engagement with equal forces. In Hitler's mind, the surface fleet had a dual status: too valuable to risk, not useful enough to justify its cost. He wanted it to do more, and he would not let it do very much. Despite the caution, preparations continued. The Ice Devils formed a picket line. Luftwaffe squadrons rehearsed coordinated torpedo and dive bomb attacks. The heavy ships slipped, one by one, from their Baltic haunts toward Norwegian fjords. and in late June, at an Icelandic anchorage wrapped in wet mist, Convoy PQ-17 began to assemble. The fjord looked almost peaceful on that June morning in 1942. Clouds pressed low over the water. Black cliffs rose up sheer on either side. Arrowhead after arrowhead of grey-painted hulls lay at anchor. British destroyers, American destroyers, corvettes, trawlers, minesweepers. Between them, like blunt-nosed cattle among watchdogs, were the merchantmen. Liberty ships, British freighters, Soviet tankers. Crews leaned on railings and watched as more ships slid in, taking their assigned places. Bows pointed toward the fjord mouth. They formed the skeleton of a convoy that would soon be a line of steel crawling through ice. There was the USS, an American destroyer whose gunners would soon prove their worth. There were British destroyers with familiar names, some still scarred from earlier Atlantic battles. There was the convoy's close escort, 6 destroyers, 2 submarines, 2 anti-aircraft vessels, 11 tugs, trawlers, and sweepers. Far to the west was the real muscle, Admiral Tovey with battleships, Duke of York, and USS Washington. Cruisers, destroyers, and the carrier Victorious. Between PQ-17 and that distant shield hovered the cruiser covering force under Rear Admiral Lewis Hamilton, 2 British and 2 American cruisers with their screens, ordered to stay just out of sight, ready to sprint toward any heavy German ships that might appear. In a low, crowded room ashore, the convoy conference went on late. Merchant captains, many of them American, sat stiff-backed as an impressive array of uniforms faced them. British admirals, American officers, staff from the Home Fleet and Western Approaches Command. Charts covered the walls. Pointers traced routes north of Norway and south of the icepack. The words U-boats, Luftwaffe, and Tirpitz recurred like drumbeats. Some captains left the room oddly reassured. All that naval brass, all that planning, all those layers of covering forces, they must count for something. Others felt a different chill. If this much steel and gold braid was needed just to get 30-odd ships to Russia, then the Germans must be waiting with something truly nasty. On June 27th, Convoy PQ-17 weighed anchor and headed out into open water. 34 merchant ships were in line. A 35th, the Liberty ship, Richard Bland, ran aground while forming up and had to limp home, her hull too badly scraped to risk the Arctic. Fog rolled in as they cleared Iceland, the same fog that would shield them from reconnaissance for a while and that would later betray them. The first days were typical of Arctic runs. Bitter wind knifed across decks and through clothing. Ice formed on rigging and superstructures, and sailors went out with hammers and axes to knock it free before it could top-heavy the ships. The convoy met fields of loose pack ice, and more than one vessel banged through to aggressively denting plates and straining frames. 3 more ships took damage. One returned to port, the other to limped onward above, though no one saw them at first. The Ice Devils were waiting. U-456 was one of them. On July 1st she saw what she'd been told to expect, a grey smudge of smoke on the northern horizon. Then, as she edged closer at periscope depth, the unmistakable pattern of a convoy, rows of masts, escort shapes flitting along the flanks, restlessly changing speed, weaving in and out. U-456 sent her message. Convoy sighted. Position, course, speed. On the German side, Rosselsprung shifted from planning to execution. In Tronomy, Tirpitz and Admiral Hipper were brought to short notice for steam. In Narvik, Admiral Scheer and Lutzow did the same. In Kiel, General Admiral Rolf Karls of Naval Group North and his staff bent over their charts. In Berlin, Raeder waited for the moment when he could tell Hitler, "The prey is in the trap." But the Arctic does not respect admirals, German or British. As Tirpitz and Hipper nosed into the intricate entrance to Altenfleet, with destroyers weaving watchfully ahead, Lutzow ran aground on a hidden shoal. Metal screamed, plates buckled, her keel took a sickening crunch. She had to be towed clear and immediately scheduled for repairs. Hours later, as Tirpitz and Hipper pressed on, 3 of their escorting destroyers, Galster Riedel and Lodi also, went onto rocks in the narrow channel. For warships, damaged before the enemy even knew they were at sea, Rosselsprung would have to proceed with a thinner screen. That evening, RAF reconnaissance planes flew over Trondheim and Narvik and saw empty berths where Tirpitz and the others had been. The Admiralty took note. A signal went to Admiral Tovey. The German heavies were likely at sea. Tovey turned toward Bear Island, putting home fleet between Norway and the convoy, trying to position himself to pounce if Tirpitz lunged outward, with his cruiser force bent south to stay in covering position. PQ-17 plodded on, unaware of the maneuvers around it. July 2nd brought the convoy's first real test. In late afternoon, as the grey sky thinned, Luftwaffe patrol aircraft from northern Norway finally found PQ-17. The U-boats shadowing the convoy began transmitting homing signals. Not long after, 9 Heinkel 115 torpedo floatplanes appeared out of the cloud. They came in low, skimming wavetops, torpedoes slung under their wings. The convoy's response was coordinated and fierce. Every gun that could bear opened fire. Tracers stitched the air. Shells burst in fountains around the oncoming aircraft. The Heinkel crews pressed in. One formation lined up, throttles forward, aiming for the trap between 2 columns of ships that would give them the best chance of a hit and the worst chance of survival. As they closed, fire intensified. The lead German aircraft was hit repeatedly, smoking, then trailing flames. It stayed on course long enough to launch, then crashed into the sea. His wingman saw it happen. Instead of pulling away, he stunned the watching Allied gunners. He put his Heinkel down on the water in a rough landing, taxied to the wreckage, and with shells and splashes towering all around, pulled the 3 men out. As the convoy watched, half admiring, half enraged, the Heinkel heaved itself back into the air and staggered away. When it was over, PQ-17 was intact. Not one ship had been hit. Sailors leaned on their guns, shaking out cramped fingers, and allowed themselves a flicker of pride. First blood to us, they thought. They did not know that, at that same moment, Tirpitz, Hipper, and Scheer were still tucked up in Altenford, and that the most dangerous decisions would not be made in Norway at all, but in London and in the grey corridors of German naval headquarters. On July 3rd, while PQ-17 crept eastward, the sea and sky played a familiar game. Fog rolled in and out. Sometimes visibility was a few cables, sometimes a few miles. The U-boats of the Ice Devil line, ordered to attack if they could, found that the combination of poor visibility and alert escorts made it difficult to get into a firing position. They settled for shadowing and reporting. On the convoy's bridges, wireless operators sat with headphones clamped to their ears, listening not only for orders from the Commodore, but for the hiss and crackle of foreign voices. At some point in the small hours, several of them heard something that made their skin crawl. It was an English voice, nasal and affected, coming from Berlin. Lord Horha, the British traitor whose propaganda broadcasts tried to needle Allied morale. That night his topic was very specific. To our American friends in Convoy PQ-17, he drawled, "We shall try to give you an Independence Day fireworks display you will not forget." Men traded glances in dim wireless rooms and mess decks. Was that just bluster? Did he actually know their position? They took the warning to heart anyway. Watches were doubled. Extra lookouts were posted at around 2:30 in the morning. Nearer to daylight than darkness, in those latitudes, aircraft sounds sliced through the wind. Engines, distant but drawing nearer. Alert orders rang along decks. Gun crews ran to their stations. The convoy braced for the promised fireworks. The weather, once again, had its say. Heavy sea fog blanketed much of the area. Many German aircraft, groping through cloud, never found the ships. One bomber finally dropped beneath the overcast and saw them, shapes in the mist, masts and funnels emerging like ghosts. He attacked alone. His torpedo splashed into the sea and ran true, not at the ships he'd lined up on, but at the next column over. It passed between two hulls, then struck the Liberty ship Christopher Newport squarely amid. The explosion punched into her machinery spaces. Steam and smoke belched out. Christopher Newport lost way and lay stopped, her back broken in the water. Her crew, knowing what a stationary ship meant in the Barents Sea, abandoned her in 2 boats. The convoy did not stop. It could not. The tug Zamalek dropped astern, braved the risk of stragglers, and hauled survivors aboard. Later, she would put a scuttling party onto Christopher Newport to finish the ship and deny her to the enemy. The other German planes, fumbling in fog, returned home empty-handed. PQ-17 closed ranks around the gap where Christopher Newport had been and pushed on. At 8 a.m., American merchant captains honored their homeland as best they could. By prior arrangement, they hauled down the worn, soot-stained stars and stripes that had been flying for weeks and hoisted fresh, crisp flags. On the cold grey water of the Barents, the red, white, and blue fluttered above masts rimed with ice. It was a small ceremony, but it mattered. Far away, in Kiel, General Admiral Rolf Karls of Naval Group North faced a different kind of ceremony, the opening moves of a major operation. If Rosselsprung was to succeed, he needed intelligence. He needed to know where the British heavy ships were, and in particular, where the carriers lay. Without that knowledge, he dared not unleash Tirpitz at around 1 p.m. One of the U-boat scouts reported sighting a British force that it described as 1 battleship, 2 cruisers, 3 destroyers. In reality, it had seen Admiral Hamilton's cruiser covering force, but in the grainy view through a periscope, light cruisers could look like battleships. The report went up the chain. Karls frowned at the message. If there really was a battleship with a covering force, Rosselsprung was too risky. He put the operation on hold and asked for clarification. The Kriegsmarine would not send its precious battleship out to face equal or superior forces unless Hitler signed off on the risk. Hitler, wary after the experiences with Bismarck and the near miss with Tirpitz, was in no mood for boldness. Colonel General Hans-Jürgen St, commanding Luftflotte 5 in Norway, had no such chains around his ankles. The Luftwaffe did not need Hitler's personal signature to mount a strike against a convoy. Stumpf had been watching the calendar and the weather for days. Every mile PQ-17 sailed eastward pushed it closer to the limit of his torpedo bomber's range. If he waited for the Navy, he might have no convoy left to attack. On the evening of July 4th, he acted. Kampfgeschwader 26's Eigruppe was alerted and briefed. 23 Heinkel 111T torpedo bombers would make the main attack. Their role, to come in low and fast, torpedoes slung beneath them, and fan out their weapons into the convoy. Ru-88s from another unit would act as dive bombers and decoys, drawing up the convoy's fire, splitting attention. At about 8 p.m., the attack began. Ru-88s appeared first, diving out of cloud toward the convoy. Guns fired up from every ship. Shells bracketed the bombers, some close enough to rock them in their dives. The Ruati-8 crews met such intense flak that most pulled away before completing their runs, dropping bombs wide or jettisoning them to lighten their aircraft. By the time the Heinkels arrived, the convoy's gunners were fully alert and keyed up. The original Plandaiv bombers, drawing fire to give torpedo planes a clearer shot, was inverted. The Heinkels flew into a wall of tracer and bursting shells. Still, some pressed home. 3 torpedoes found targets. One hit the Liberty ship William Hooper. Another tore into the British freighter. A third slammed into the Soviet tanker Azerbaijan. The convoy watched as William Hooper and Navarino took on water and began to sag in the water. Fires started on Azerbaijan. Messages crackled over the convoy frequency. Rescue tugs and minesweepers detached to pick up survivors, darting between columns in the fading light. Behind the smoke and confusion, 2 Ice Devil U-boats also loosed their torpedoes, trying to exploit the distraction. None of those shots hit. The real damage had been done by the Luftwaffe. Over the next hour, Azerbaijan reported that her crew had brought her fires under control. Damage parties shored up bulkheads. Pumps roared. She signaled Commodore Dowding, make convoy speed. For the moment, PQ-17 had taken a punch and stayed upright. It was after this action, with the convoy tired but defiant, that the signals from London arrived. Not Luftwaffe bombs, not U-boat torpedoes, but a different kind of shock, transmitted in groups of 5 letters. Stamped, secret, and most immediate. Shortly after 9 p.m., on the bridges of the cruisers in Rear Admiral Hamilton's covering force, signalman unfolded the first message. Cruiser force withdraw to westward at high speed. Hamilton stared at the words, withdraw. With the convoy about to enter the most dangerous stretch, the order was clear, and yet every instinct in him rebelled. He had been told earlier to expect further instructions. He had not expected this. At 9:23 came the second blow. Owing to threat from surface ships, convoy is to disperse and proceed to Russian ports. Disperse, to those who understood the code, that meant break convoy formation and proceed as a loose body. Each ship making best speed, but still in the same general area. A bad idea, but not yet a catastrophe. Before they could digest that, a third signal arrived. Convoy is to scatter. In the Admiralty's Mersig codebook, that word had a specific meaning. Scattering meant not simply breaking formation, but fanning out, each ship on its own track, proceeding independently toward Russian ports. In effect, abandoning the protection of formation and escorts on the bridges of warships and merchantmen alike. Captains stared at these messages and drew the same conclusion. For the Admiralty to take such a drastic step, something must be coming. Not U-boats, not bombers, something bigger. The German battle fleet, Tirpitz and her consorts, must be just over the horizon. If those ships fell upon a tight convoy, they could slaughter it. Scattering, in this logic, might give, at least, some merchantmen a chance to slip away in fog and midnight sun. It was a logic born of fear and imperfect information, and it was wrong. In London, the chain of events that led to those 3 signals had begun hours earlier. RAF reconnaissance had reported the heavy German berths at Trondheim and Narvik empty. Ultra-decrypts and other intelligence suggested increased radio traffic along the Norwegian coast. Yet no one in the Admiralty's operations and intelligence rooms could say, with certainty, Tirpitz is at sea now, on this course, nor could anyone say, with equal confidence, she remains in anchored and idle. Commander Norman Denning, the officer responsible for tracking German surface units, tried to explain the nature of his not knowing to his superiors. His agents and his intercept teams would likely not send a special alert if Tirpitz stayed in harbor. They would, however, send one if she sailed or if preparations for sailing were underway. No such explicit alert had yet come. That suggested that the heavy ships might still be in, but it was not proof. Admiral Pound listened to Denning, listened to his other experts, and then retired to his inner office with only a small group of staff officers. They went around the room, each giving an opinion. Most argued that the convoy should stay together and that the cruiser covering force should remain in place, at least until there was firmer evidence of a surface sortie. Vice Admiral Moore, Pound's immediate subordinate, voiced the more pessimistic view. Tirpitz was likely at sea, and if she fell upon the convoy in close formation, the result would be a massacre. Finally, Pound leaned back in his chair and shut his eyes. The picture in his mind was stark. A 16-inch shell smashing into a merchant ship's hull. Then another and another, the convoy blown apart under the guns of a ship that no British vessel in the area could match. Home fleet, with Duke of York and Washington, was still hundreds of miles away, busy with its own fuel concerns. If Tirpitz came in before Tovey could close, there would be no contest. The intelligence was incomplete. The risks, in his mind, were clear. When he opened his eyes and spoke, he had already chosen to assume the worst-case scenario, that German heavy ships were either already at sea or would be very soon, and that they would come straight for PQ-17. He dictated the first message, ordering the cruiser force to withdraw to the west at high speed. In his view, their presence near the convoy would not save it from Tirpitz, and might simply offer the Germans more valuable targets. Those cruisers, if preserved, could still be used elsewhere. He then drafted the signal, ordering the convoy to disperse and make for Russian ports. That, he thought, would prevent the merchantman from being caught bunched together under the guns of a battleship. It was only after the signal had gone that Admiral Moore pointed out the ambiguity in the Mersig book. Disperse did not carry the sense of complete scattering Pound had in mind. I meant them to scatter, Pound said. So he wrote a third signal, clarifying his intent. The convoy was to scatter fanwise and proceed independently. He walked those messages himself to the communications room. He watched as they were encoded, then sent. By the time he returned to his office, the first of them was already on its way through the ether, hopping from station to station and being decoded aboard warships and merchantmen under the pale light of the midnight sun. At sea, Rear Admiral Hamilton obeyed. He turned his cruisers westward, away from the convoy, and ordered the destroyers of the close escort to join him. Every instinct told him it was wrong, but the Admiralty's tone left no space for argument. The remaining smaller escorts, corvettes, trawlers, tugs, and armed tramps, were told nothing specific. Lacking clear instructions, they did what seemed natural. They scattered with the merchant ships. On the bridges of the freighters, Commodores' whistles blew and flag signals hoisted. Formation broke. Ships that had held their places in neat lines now sheered away, some swinging north, some east, some south. Soon, where there had been a coherent convoy, there was only a ragged scatter of ships, each seeking its own path through fog and ice. The U-boats and shadowing German aircraft watched the transformation with disbelief. For days they had been reporting a defended convoy, bristling with escort guns. Now, as if on cue, the ships were peeling away from one another, presenting their flanks, leaving gaps in which lone submarines and isolated bomber crews could hunt. Admiral commanding the Ice Devil Group, could scarcely believe his luck when confirmation came that the convoy had dispersed. Shortly after 1 a.m. on July 5, he signaled his boats, "Attack at will." No need to report back and coordinate. Every lone ship was now prey. Before many crews had finished breakfast, 2 merchantmen had been sent to the bottom by U-boat torpedoes. Others were being stalked, chased, reported. In Norway, Rosselsprung lurched into motion. News that the Allied cruiser covering force had turned away convinced Admiral Karls that the risk was now acceptable. Hitler's cautious approval was obtained. At Altenford, Admiral Otto Schneewind, flag in Tirpitz, ordered anchors weighed. Tirpitz, Admiral Hipper, Admiral Scheer, and a screen of destroyers headed northeast, bows knifing through the cold sea, toward the quadrant where scattered shapes of PQ-17 were still trying to find their bearings. At the same time, Luftflotte 5 in Norway launched everything it could put into the air. Heinkels, Junkers, reconnaissance aircraft, all were sent to exploit the chaos. It was at this point that the strange symmetry of misperception turned against the Germans. Off the North Cape, a Soviet submarine patrolling the approaches sighted the German heavy ships and began sending sighting reports. A British submarine, also on patrol, saw them as well. Those reports, intercepted and analyzed, let the Allies know that the German surface group was indeed out. On their side, German radio operators suddenly found their communications being jammed. It was, in fact, the first time the British had used large-scale jamming against German naval traffic in this theatre. To German ears, the interference sounded like an invisible hand cutting the threads between their ships and headquarters. At Naval Group North and in Berlin, staff officers read the jamming, combined it with the submarine reports, and drew a disturbing conclusion. The British must be reacting. That could only mean one thing. The home fleet, with its battleships and carrier, must be closing in to block the return path of Tirpitz and her SORTS. In reality, Admiral Tovey was wrestling with fuel considerations and heading his ships back toward Scapa Flow. But the Germans did not know that. Faced with the possibility of their heavy ships being trapped between British battleships to the west and rocky Norwegian coasts to the east, they flinched. Grand Admiral Redder, after an hour of discussion and worry, cancelled Rosselsprung. Shortly before 10 p.m., orders went out. Admiral Schneewind was to reverse course and return to port. The mighty Tirpitz, which had never yet fired her guns in anger at an enemy ship, turned away from the scattered, helpless remnants of PQ-17 without ever seeing them. By then, she was no longer needed. The damage had already been done. The day after the scatter order was one of pure hunting for the Germans and pure nightmare for the men of PQ-17. Lone ships steamed through the Arctic, their wakes white scars against a glassy grey sea, without the comforting and masking presence of their neighbours. Every mast and funnel felt exposed. Captains ordered zigzag courses. Lookouts scanned relentlessly, eyes watering from cold and strain. Gunners huddled at ready-use lockers, hands on breech blocks, knowing that if a Ru-88 or Heinkel appeared, the only help they would have would be their own guns. The Ice Devils made the most of it. U-boat commanders who might once have hesitated to attack a heavily escorted convoy now found solitary freighters crossing their periscopes at ranges that seemed indecently close. Torpedoes were fired, tracks watched, detonations heard. Some ships went down quickly, broken spines sending bow and stern heaving into the air. Others burned, presenting monstrous candles against the low cloud, attracting further attention. From the air, the scene had an almost surreal quality. German bomber crews who had rehearsed attacks on tight ship formations now saw isolated specks scattered across miles of sea, each one a potential kill. Coordinated mass attacks were not needed. Pairs of aircraft, even singles, could swoop down at mast height and loose their torpedoes. On one merchantman, the crew watched helplessly as a Ru-88 came in so low they could see the pilot's goggles. Tracers leaped from the ship's guns, but the bomber kept coming, skimming the wavetops, then dropping its torpedo and banking away. The white wake of the weapon curved in toward the hull. Men ran, although they had nowhere to go. A moment later, the world exploded in green water and fire. Not every attack succeeded. Some ships jinked just enough to throw off a torpedo's lead angle. Others were saved by mechanical failure. But the odds, ship by ship, were terrible. Rescue vessels tried to do what they could. Some tugs and trawlers had been specifically assigned to pick up survivors, and their skippers showed courage equal to any frontline warship. They sailed into oil slicks, threaded their way among floating wreckage, fished men from rafts and open boats, sometimes under continued air attack. Elsewhere, lifeboats pulled away from sinking ships and watched their former homes go under. Men huddled together against spray and cold, counting their number and their chances. For some, help would come. For others, the Arctic would finish what bomb and torpedo had begun. The tallies mounted in the end. Of the 35 merchant ships that had sailed under the PQ-17 banner, only 11 would reach Russian ports. 24 would be sunk or scuttled. 16 of those went down in a single day. The greatest one-day loss of merchant tonnage on the high seas suffered by either side in the entire war. With them went roughly 150,000 tons of cargo, nearly 3,300 trucks that would never carry Soviet infantry or supplies, 200 aircraft that would never take off from Russian fields, 435 battle tanks that would never rumble toward a German panzer division, 100,000 tons of ammunition, food, and general supplies enough to equip an army of over 50,000 men. 153 Allied seamen were killed, many of them in lonely corners of the sea, with no witness but their own shipmates and the men trying to kill them. On one of the surviving ships, a British freighter, the captain stood on the bridge as a Heinkel torpedo bomber lined up for an attack. The ship's gunners fired, but the aircraft held its nerve. The torpedo left its sling and churned across the water. The captain watched, feeling time stretch, as the weapon approached. At what he thought was the last second, the torpedo porpoised dove too deep, and passed under the ship without detonating. "Not this time," the captain muttered, then immediately began scanning for the next attack, because there was always a next one. The British freighter Navarino, hit in the earlier July 4th attack, was not so lucky. After being abandoned, she drifted, burning, her holds full of ammunition and war stores. As the convoy sailed on, men on other ships saw a torpedo strike her again. There was a flash, then a deeper explosion as something in her cargo went up. Her bow rose, then vanished in a column of spray and smoke. For the sailors of PQ-17, the sense of betrayal took root quickly. On many bridges and mess decks, the question was asked aloud. Why did they leave us? Why did they take the destroyers and cruisers away just when we needed them most? No answer was forthcoming. Orders came, in cold code words, but they did not explain themselves. In Archangel and Murmansk, Soviet officials counted the ships that arrived and compared them to the manifests they had been given. They counted, too, the tanks that were not delivered, the crates that did not appear on quaysides, the trucks that never rolled down the gangways. Then they cabled Moscow. News of PQ-17's fate did not break immediately in London or Washington. It seeped, instead, through shipping offices and wardrooms, passed along by men who had been there. Ships that had turned back early brought back rumors of attacks and losses. Ships that had reached Russia then sailed home in QP convoys, brought more precise stories. In London, Parliament demanded answers. A House of Commons inquiry was convened. Admirals and staff officers were summoned to explain what had happened, who had given which orders, and why. Admiral Pound did not hide behind subordinates. He admitted, calmly and publicly, that he had made the decision to withdraw the cruisers and to order the convoy to disperse and then scatter. He laid out his reasoning. Intelligence had suggested a German surface sword. Home fleet, he argued, was not in a position to intervene. The cruisers, if caught by Tirpitz, would likely be sunk. The convoy, if kept together, would present a compact target for heavy guns. In retrospect, critics argued, his one crucial error had been the weight he gave to the possibility of a surface attack, compared to the certainty of U-boats and aircraft. By scattering the convoy, he had removed its one real defense against the latter two threats: concentrated gunfire and mutual support. Others pointed out that even had Tirpitz and her consorts found PQ-17 in convoy, they would have had only a limited window to engage before fuel constraints and the risk of intervention by home fleet forced them away. The convoy might have taken severe losses, but it is far from certain that those losses would have exceeded what actually happened. It is also far from certain that the Germans would have pressed such an attack once British heavy units were believed to be within range. The razor-edge nature of the intelligence became clearer only after the war. German records showed that Tirpitz, Scheer, and Hipper had not left Altenford until after PQ-17 had already begun to disperse, and that they turned back before ever coming within striking distance. The surface threat, in other words, had been real, but MISTIMED. Admiral Pound, however, did not have the luxury of hindsight. In July 1942, he had been forced to choose between bad options in a war whose outcome was still uncertain. His health was already failing. He would die the following year, never seeing the full historical verdict on his decision. If the British were cautious in their public criticism, the Soviets were not. In Moscow, Stalin's reaction was swift and scathing. To him, PQ-17's losses were not just tonnage figures, they were tanks that would not stop German panzers on the Don, aircraft that would not defend Stalingrad, food that would not reach besieged cities. Soviet communiques accused the British of cowardice, of abandoning their duty, even of treachery. It did not help that the British refused, in the immediate aftermath, to dispatch another convoy through the Arctic route. Ships slated for PQ-18 were held back. Vessels that had returned to Iceland waited idle or were reassigned. The Admiralty, bloodied by PQ-17, would not risk a repeat in high summer when the Luftwaffe would have long days and clear skies on its side. Pressure built again from both Moscow and Washington. Roosevelt reminded Churchill of his earlier remark, justified if half get through, and hinted that American public opinion might not look kindly on the British if aid to their Soviet ally faltered. Stalin, while demanding more deliveries, made dark references to other possibilities if support did not materialize. Under that combined pressure, and with some further improvements in escort arrangements, the Admiralty relented. PQ-18 sailed in September with 40 merchant ships, this time accompanied by an escort carrier, one of the so-called jeep carriers, to provide continuous air cover. Luftwaffe torpedo bombers attacked. U-boats stalked. 10 merchantmen were sunk by aircraft, 3 by submarines. Losses were still heavy, but well short of PQ-17's catastrophe. After that, the Admiralty imposed a pause. No more Arctic convoys would sail in the long daylight of autumn. The next series of convoys would be scheduled for mid, when darkness and foul weather would do what no admiral or air Marshall could guarantee hide ships from the enemy's eyes. When they resumed in December, the eastbound convoys were redesignated with a new code, JW, instead of PQ. No official admitted that the change was symbolic, but every sailor understood. PQ-17 had become a byword, almost a curse. JW convoys would be a fresh start. Yet even as the code letters changed, the basic truth remained. Any supply line that runs under skies dominated by the enemy is a bleeding artery. Rear Admiral Hamilton, the cruiser commander who had watched in anger as his ships turned away from PQ-17, had warned about this even before the convoy sailed. The Royal Navy, he argued, had neglected its fleet air arm, deferring too much to the Royal Air Force. Without proper carrier air power, the Navy was being asked to protect far-flung shipping with guns alone. Any communication line operated without control of its airspace is foredoomed, he said later. The Arctic convoys had proved the point in blood and steel. In the years after the war, naval historians would return, again and again, to PQ-17, not just for its drama, but for what it revealed about decision-making under pressure. Messages from this side, intercepts from that. Admirals in different capitals, making choices based on partial truths and outright errors. Pound's assumption that Tirpitz was at sea. German assumptions that British battleships were closing in. Each side overestimating the other's proximity and resolve. In another reality, Tirpitz might have pressed on, found the convoy still in formation, and fought a short, brutal gunnery action before turning away under threat from Duke of York and Washington. In that reality, historians might have written about the folly of having so many merchant ships concentrated under heavy guns. In this reality, U-boats and Heinkels, not 16-inch shells, did the work. For the men who had sailed in PQ-17, abstractions about intelligence and strategy mattered less than simpler truths. They remembered standing at a gun as a torpedo track arrowed in. They remembered watching another ship vanish in a column of water and flame. They remembered the peculiar silence after a vessel went under, the way the sea closed over it without ceremony. And they remembered looking at an empty horizon and knowing that the ships that had been sent to protect them were no longer there. Decades later, an aging merchant captain, survivor of PQ-17, was asked what he felt when he thought back on the convoy. Cold, he said first. Then, after a pause, and that somebody ashore had made a mistake, and it wasn't him that froze. The Arctic keeps no records of convoys or code names. Ships pass, icebergs drift, storms rake the water. In that indifferent world, PQ-17 was just a group of hulls that went in and came out fewer. But in the history of World War II at sea, its story stands as a hard lesson. That courage at the sharp end can be undone by fear at the center. And that in war, the most devastating blows may be delivered not by the enemy, but by your own decisions,